Hello, all. I am Lieutenant Dan with the Workplace Violence Mitigation Podcast, and I am your host. Welcome to episode 7, which is we're going to talk to a very special guest that I have today. Back in 2019, I wrote a book about active shooter response called If You're Looking for a Victim, Keep Looking. And one of the folks that I interviewed for that book uh, is named Samantha, and her story is outlined in chapter 8. Fortunately, I've been able to keep in touch with Samantha over the years, and she is going to tell us her story of survival and how she came to save herself in a very sticky situation. So, Samantha, welcome to the show, and thank you for giving me your time.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. Yeah. As you know, my name's Samantha. Sometimes I go by Sam. So Sam and Dan. And I'm an HR professional by trade. My background, I've mostly worked in businesses in the manufacturing industry. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. But my story I think that we're gonna dive into today isn't related to my work experiences. It's a very unique story to tell. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
So, Sam, we met years ago when we came out to do some training at your facility, and that's how I became aware of your story, so to speak, during the pre-training discussions that we had. This happened to you when you were younger, and like you said, it had nothing to do with workplace violence, but it was a violent attack. Why don't you
Yes.
kind of take us there and walk us through exactly what happened to you before we get into how you actually saved yourself in the aftermath?
Um, my story is rather unique. As you know, it's not workplace related, but instead it occurred prior to my professional work life beginning. I was really young, still an adult. That I can still remember this happening, it was so vividly, even though it was decades ago. I recall being at a party with friends. Mind you, that probably the last party I actually ever attended like this. I remember as I was leaving out the front door with my then boyfriend, he was ahead of me a bit. There was a girl who began pushing him in front of me. I saw this as I rounded the corner. And I saw, you know, at that house party, she just pushed him into that garage door. And I remember looking at her and yelling, "Don't push my boyfriend." And, she was short in stature. She was heavier set than I was. But my then boyfriend, he was a big guy. He's 6'4". He's not the type of individual that would start a fight, let alone with another man, let alone with another woman. So to me, this was a little out of character, and I could tell perhaps she was intoxicated. Uh, and immediately she turned to me, Dan. You know, she then pushed me to the ground, and it was a concrete driveway. And I just remember starting to swing my arms. One attacker turned into three. I was seeing clearly for the most part, so I know there was three of them. And I still remember that feeling, on that ground. It was a warm summer night. Ground was warm, wasn't burning hot, thankfully. But I remember during that time, my body, it just had so much energy. It was just fighting and that adrenaline just flowing through you. I didn't know I was bleeding at all. I was trying to keep myself, fight for my life. I felt at that point in time. I didn't know I was bleeding until a friend yelled at me that my arm was bleeding. That's when I immediately looked down, and I clasped my hand over my left arm. And, you know, I remember them running with my boyfriend and another friend to a church across the way. And, while we were hiding, I told him, I was like, "Give me your belt." And I made my own version of the tourniquet. And I didn't know where I was cut. There was so much blood at that time. I have the scars still now. I know where I got cut now. At that time, I knew it was really deep. Um, you know, I didn't know if it was in an artery, where it was. It was scary. It was really scary, Dan.
So where did it turn out that the wound actually was, Sam?
She barely missed my artery. I was very, very lucky. Her weapon of choice was a beer bottle. And, I still glass my arm to this day. And I have probably about one, two, two noticeable wounds on my left arm and a couple of wounds, in my clavicle and my neck. So she got me pretty good.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds like it. So was the wound that you were bleeding from, was it on the inside of your arm, bicep area, outside? Where was it exactly?
Near the bicep. So right on top. So, if you're flexing, if you want to have like a nice visual, right there on top, it's right there in the open.
And you had more than one cut, correct?
Yeah, several cuts, but biggest one was the one that came closest to that artery.
So here's the part about your story that is so impressive. I was in law enforcement for 24 years. We had extensive training on tourniquets and first aid as it related to gunshot wounds and stabbings and things that we may very easily encounter while we're on duty. You had no such training, is that correct?
That's correct. Nothing.
So I got to ask, and I know I asked you this before when I wrote the book, where did you learn how to do this?
I think I remember when we talked about this before. I suppose it's something I saw through television. Really no idea where I learned to do this, Dan. My story happened, as you know, before the boom of smartphones, before there's chat GPT, before generative AI, before there's a simple way to ask, to find something out.
Right.
The only training I really had, honestly, before this was a junior lifeguard program, which I know they did not train you how to do that. The
Right.
best thing I had closest to it was CPR. I thankfully, just my headspace in that moment, I remember it just immediately went calm. And
Yeah.
I just remember having that clarity when we went into that safe space, or at least I felt it was a safe space to get out of there, and I just focus on what I need to do to make sure I would be okay.
And that it frankly is absolutely incredible. Most people under those circumstances would lose their mind and lose all focus. And the fact that it came into focus for you at that particular time is nothing short of amazing. And obviously, you were successful because you're still here with us today. But you applied this tourniquet yourself. Once you had the tourniquet on, did you notice that the bleeding had subsided or stopped?
It subsided.
Okay.
So it wasn't gushing as bad. I thankfully, it was still really scary, Dan, just
And you
really terrified.
went from there, you were taken to the hospital by ambulance, correct? Really?
I was just kind of walking around thinking like, okay, maybe it's not that bad. Looking down, at that point in time in my life, I was just didn't know better. Um, and call my dad, right? When you're around that age, call your dad. Um, Dad says, "What are you doing?" Go to the hospital. I go to the ER. Um, and that's where they cleaned me up the best they could. They irrigated it out. They illuminated it, and that's where I know to this day I still have a ton of glass particles in my arm. And I can tell you to this day, when I lift weights, my left arm can't lift as much weight as my right arm because of that damage.
Yeah.
And it's to this day, I'm reminded of that, not just because of the scarring, but because of the limitations of what happened to my body.
So You left the scene, you went home, you called your father. Did you have the tourniquet on this entire time?
Oh, yeah, I left it on there. I was too scared to take that thing off.
Yeah,
I didn't I remember what it looked like beforehand, so I didn't wanna take it off.
yeah, right. So how long do you think how much time do you think elapsed between the time of the incident? I should let me back that up. How much time elapsed from the time you applied the tourniquet to the time you got to the hospital?
And I couldn't really remember. If I could estimate, maybe 20 minutes, 20, 30 minutes, if that.
Okay.
Not too long.
Yeah. Much longer, you would have had real damage to your arm.
Yeah, you can't leave those things that long on. That's what I've heard.
Yeah. Very, very, very fortunate. And once you got to the hospital, you said that you had to undergo surgery for this, correct?
Yeah, they had to irrigate it, just stitched it up as best as possible, and then I had to go back and go see a specialist.
Interesting. Very interesting. I appreciate you walking us through this event. So now that you've got many, many years behind you since this thing occurred. You had told me before that you wanted your face blocked out on this during this call because nobody was ever actually arrested or charged during this event. Is that accurate?
That's true.
Did the police investigate it at all? What did they do with this?
I know I filed a report, when I went over to that church, I was very fortunate that an officer found me, talked to them. They made sure I was okay, um, to the point being, right? They did ask if I wanted to go to the hospital in the ambulance. I said no. Uh, I did file a report, but I don't remember any follow up from them. I also at that time, Dan, I didn't pursue it
Yeah,
because, it was terrifying. I had, just not just one, but three. And so I just wanted to get out of there. No, they've never been found, no follow up, uh, anything.
yeah, yeah. Jack, uh, if you don't mind my asking, how old were you during this event?
I don't think, I think I was maybe early 20s. I can't really remember my age, Dan.
So college age, correct? Sam, did they had you ever seen any of your attackers prior to this? Did your boyfriend have any idea who they were? Any
No,
prior contact?
no, these were, house parties around that age where
Yeah,
you have random people show up. There's sometimes 20, there's sometimes 50 people there. And, people make bad decisions when they've been consuming alcohol.
very true. Very true. So I know you said you've had some physical limitations as you get a little older since the incident. What has this done to you emotionally? I mean, do you carry this constant fear with you? Is it something that you were able to put behind you and move forward? We've talked about this a couple of times, but I've never really discussed with you what it's done to you as far as how you view the world in the aftermath.
Yeah. So how it's kind of impacted day to day and how I view things. And, I think your book really has my perspective. It says if you're looking for a victim, keep looking. I'm extremely situationally aware everywhere I go. Anytime I am out and about, I'm always aware of my surroundings, the people, the exits, etc. Anything that comes into play. In manufacturing, they say keep your head on a swivel. I do the same thing outside of work too. And it's not out of fear. It's out of ensuring like something like this never happens to me ever again.
Good for you. Good for you. And if anything positive could possibly come of this event, that would be it. I tell people all the time, You spent an entire career, 24 years I was in law enforcement. That's a lot of baggage in the aftermath to take with you, and it's had uh, a lot of negative impact on my being in the aftermath. However, the one gift, one takeaway that was phenomenal from that was that I am constantly situationally aware. I would never trade that for anything. I feel like it has saved me a number of times. So the fact that you can say that's been a takeaway from you for you, I should say, I think is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Sam, you've also undergone our training for the active shooter. It was many, many years ago. But what kind of impact do you think that creating scenarios similar to what you experienced in real life does for the participant?
You know, I think what it does is, it gives them something to think about. Uh, when you go through trainings and I've gone through them in different workplaces, where it's a video or a PowerPoint presentation, and you have, a great facilitator presenting this information. It's one thing, right? But when you have a scenario where you're living it and you're going through iterations like we did, people experience it differently. They think about it differently. In the event that something like that should happen, I would hope that they would have that situational awareness to respond differently and better than someone that sat through a video or just a PowerPoint presentation. Not
Right.
saying that they would be, right? And not saying that it would be different, but I would hope that that would be something that would drive a little bit more engagement and they would take something more way that would resonate with them.
Sam, have you expounded on that training at all? I mean, given the experience that you had, did you ever go back and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to take some stop the bleed training, or I'm going to do something to make sure that especially as a parent, when you have kids, if I ever have to do this again, I want to make sure that I understand how the tourniquet actually functions and what it's for and its purpose and how I turn it on and turn it off and how important those timing of that is. Did you ever follow up with any of that, or is this something that you have simply put in your memory banks and put behind you?
In different workplaces I've been at since then, I have done first responder training where I have been on company safety teams. I do remember one where in our toolkit, they did show us tourniquets, and I was surprised they actually had them in there. To be honest with you, and how to apply a temporary one. That was many moons ago. I do try to make sure I maintain at least an active AED CPR certification for at home and also at work. But I really hope I don't ever have to use any of what I've learned ever again.
Sure.
Um,
Sam, as we kind of wrap this up on the back end, I got to tell you, you've had an experience that, despite all of my law enforcement years, I've never had. I've never come to a situation where I've got to render first aid to myself that was anything more than applying a band-aid. I was very, very fortunate. So I'm intrigued by your story as such. Anything that you can tell our viewers and our listeners based on the experience that you had that you think might be a good takeaway for them?
yeah, you hear people say remain calm, right? You hear that a lot when there's an evacuation, there's a situation that maybe there's some chaos going on. And we know that that's not always the easiest thing to do. But I feel like that's one thing that helped me the most in this situation. I had that ability to calm myself. And because of that, I feel like I was able to prevent myself from going into shock and making the situation I was in worse for me than it already was. For me, I was extremely lucky. So I think my best piece of advice, go to a different headspace, remain as calm as you can, try to think clearly in that type of situation. And, I think for me, my survival instincts just kicked in. I think that's what truly saved me in that moment.
Yeah, and when you're injured like that or put into a situation like that, adrenaline can be certainly your friend, right? It gets you into that fight or flight mode, and that's a good thing. However, it also not only speeds up things like your breathing and your heart rate, but it can distort audio and visual perceptions of things. There are plenty of studies to show how that works. Law enforcement's doing these studies on this all the time. So the fact that you were able to, I genuinely have no explanation for, giving the age you were and the fact that you had no formal training in this. What made you calm yourself down and control those things so that you could pull this off with this tourniquet is nothing short of amazing. It really is not. I always, I tell your story frequently when we're doing training sessions and say, look, the point that I'm trying to drive home to these people is not only do you have the ability to do this, your life may depend on it, because nobody is going to get there in time to save you. You're going to have to save yourself. And truth be told, with the injury you had, if you had not applied your own first aid the way you did, this might have had a completely different ending. So, Sam, I appreciate your time. I know that it's tough to take time out of your evening, especially when you got a family at home that you're dealing with. So, but I thought it was important to get your story out there to our listeners as one of just showing them what humans are actually capable of when they have no choice. And when you're involved in a situation like this, a lot of times you have no choice. Nobody's going to get there in time to save you. You've got to do this for yourself. So I do appreciate your time, and I appreciate you going through the effort of sharing your story. I know that this cannot necessarily be easy for you to go back and relive this thing, but know that I truly believe that it's helping other people by letting them listen to this. So I want to thank you for your time. For those of you that are listening, keep in mind that we do not have any sponsors for this show. We try to bring you relevant, good information that can do you some good as you move forward in your efforts to keep yourself safe both at work and away from work. So if you like the content, you want to continue to see this, please like it, share our channel, and let everybody know. Until then, I'm going to be signing off, and we will see you next time for the next episode.